everyone. This is Dr. Heather Austin Roblard, and this lecture is going to be over the classification of addictive drugs. We're going to look over a few different things. First is going to be the different scheduled class drugs, how the government identifies the level of severity for each drug in order to criminalize each of those drugs. And then we'll talk about the classifications of drugs based on how they impact the body. Before I go into this lecture fully, there's some important things to understand when it comes to evaluating information. I know we have already discussed a little bit about the difference between empirical and non-empirical data. And in this part, we're going to talk about researcher bias. So a lot of the information that I'll be giving you comes from different researchers. So these are people, academics who have studied animals, humans, all these kind of species in order to determine how drugs impact the human body. They've also discussed how they impact other factors like societal, financial, medical. And the important thing to understand that when we're looking at research and data is to identify any possible researcher bias. Researcher bias in research is when an experimenter might have a bias. Like let's say they're trying to study a hypothesis of do drugs cause bad behaviors. They may look at their research or ask certain questions in a certain way that lends towards their bias, where the answers are kind of giving them what they're searching for. The other thing to recognize is there's a difference between objective and subjective research. Objective is not influenced by a person's feelings or opinions, considering or representing facts. Like if you say something is a color, that's not really opinion, it's observable and objective. Subjective is based on or influenced by personal feelings, tastes, and opinions. So for example of that, if you had somebody describe what an orange tastes like, it might be subjective because it will depend, the description will depend on that person. Some other examples of what might cause researcher bias could be they use the wrong design or method to collect data and answer questions. For example, this one shows kids and breakfast. Compared to children who skip breakfast, a study showed that children who ate breakfast performed better at school, recorded higher test scores, and reduced absenteeism and tardiness. So they use this data to show that eating Cheerios will help with performing at school better. But again, this is researcher bias because Cheerios doesn't necessarily help people. It's just having a breakfast might help somebody get higher test scores. Selection or participation bias. So they may have a non-representative sample. So then there's using data collection and measurement bias. So using a non-validated instrument or an incorrect measurement for a specific kind of factor, or there's some kind of response error. So participants in the study were reading a question wrong, and so that can cause a response error. Then there's analysis bias. This is like where you create your entire research to get a specific hypothesis answered. And so you're kind of fishing for that data rather than letting the data present itself as is. But you're looking for that data to confirm your hypothesis. Then there's publication bias. So maybe you're only publishing the things that are statistically significant to your study and not reporting the other things that came out of your study. Or maybe you provided poor interview methods that created incorrect data. And then the other one would be sponsor or funding bias. So maybe you attempt to show the data based on what your funders are trying to search for and what they're paying you for. So all of these things are important whenever you hear information is how can I look for, does this have researcher bias? How can I evaluate that? Okay, something to be aware of is that drugs are not all alike. Now, currently the United States has a drug scheduling guide. So that's schedule 1 through 5, and each of these determine, so if you get caught with a certain scheduled drug, that will determine what kind of criminalization you might get. It's typically supposed to be based off the harm and the medicinal purpose of that drug. But you'll see that not all of that is based completely on harm or drug. Some of it might be based on political agenda. So we'll start with Schedule 1, which is supposed to be the most potential for abuse, and it has little to no medical qualities. And you'll see what's listed in here is heroin, LSD, marijuana, ecstasy, and peyote. So a lot of people might be looking at marijuana as first. There's a lot of research out there that does show that it might have some medicinal purposes, and that there is very little physical abuse or dependence with marijuana. So again, you might be asking yourself, why is it in Schedule 1 then? That really comes from when they made it illegal. There was a political agenda behind that, and they just haven't changed it. Hopefully we'll see that changing a little bit more, and we are seeing it change in the states that are legalizing marijuana. The next one is Schedule 2. So this one should have a high potential for abuse or dependence and some medicinal qualities. So that might be Vicodin, cocaine, meth, Oxycontin, Adderall. Then there's Schedule 3, which is moderate potential for abuse, acceptable medicine qualities, and a doctor's prescription is required. So this includes Tylenol with codeine, ketamine, steroids, and testosterone. And then Schedule 4 is low potential for abuse and dependence, acceptance of medical qualities, prescriptions required. Those are our Xanax, Valium, Tramadol, all of those prescribed drugs. The lowest potential for abuse and dependence is Schedule 5, and this is used for acceptable medicine qualities, and then a prescription is also required. The fewest refill regulations. So this is like cough medicine, Robitussin, Motrin, all of those kinds of things. So when you're looking at this, be thinking about, do you feel like all of those drugs listed fit in the correct schedule? How would you organize that? It's kind of important to evaluate that information for yourself, and it may change throughout the semester. Okay, so here are a few other graphs to kind of evaluate here. This is based on the harm that each of these drugs can create. So if you see over here on the right-hand side, we have a plot chart that shows the level of dependency that these drugs have, as well as the physical harm that they typically portray. So we can see that cannabis is over here as right on like a 1.5 in dependency, whereas the physical harm is about a 1. And then you can notice that heroin is at a 3 for dependency and pretty close to a 3 for harm. You even see alcohol or tobacco kind of in the middle. They're right above 2 on the harms or on the dependency scale, and then they're about 1.5 on the harm. The blue graph shows you harm to others and harm to its users. So you'll notice that alcohol has the highest harm towards others and a pretty high harm towards its users as well, even above heroin and crack. So that's something to be really considering of. You can see how mushrooms down below has like a 0 harm to others. Same with LSD. Those are just a little bit of harm towards themselves. All of this is important to look at when we understand the effect of drugs on our systems. So with the 3 classifications that drugs are typically broken into, again, it's based on how they impact the body. And to simplify it, it's going to be, how does it impact the central nervous system? Remember, there's the parasympathetic nervous system, which will determine if you need that fight or flight response. It controls the body in that regard. So depressants depress the central nervous system, so it slows it down. And then stimulants increase or alert the central nervous system. So it either hypes it up or it at least makes it very on alert. And then hallucinogens try to kind of do all of it at the same time. They just overstimulate the central nervous system so it doesn't really know what to do. Let's first look at depressants. So these include alcohol, benzodiazepines, barbiturates, and opiates. They create very similar symptoms, like they reduce anxiety. They can typically induce something similar to anesthesia. They can create disorientation, poor motor coordination, slurred speech. Some of the long-term effects that they might have are they can create addiction, cause major sleep disturbances, brain damage, heart disease, liver disease, and even death. With alcohol in particular, this is a sedative and hypnotic drug, so it makes you kind of sleepy. It's the most widely used drug in the United States. It causes inhibition and depresses the central nervous system. The alcohol is actually more toxic to the organs than any other drug. It impacts every single organ in your body. It affects and lowers inhibitions it also impairs memory. So another important part to talk about with depressant is the blood alcohol level. If you've ever heard of this is the point of recognition of how they determine if you're over the limit for drinking for minors and possessions, DWIs, all that. So 0.08 is when you are legally intoxicated in most states. Death can occur at a 0.3 intoxication. It's important to note that women also have a higher blood alcohol levels because they have more body fat and less body water. And the more alcohol that gets passed through the small intestines to be absorbed. Larger people tend to have lower blood alcohol levels than smaller people, which is kind of interesting. However, anybody can drink enough fast enough for it to be fatal. One of the most legal drug combinations is actually mixing alcohol with cocaine. So this can be an acute or prolonged use. It can create chemical called cosethylene, which is very toxic to the body. Another thing about alcohol is the social consequences that come with it. There's a lot of data here that you can evaluate based on those studies, but it is the third leading lifestyle-related death in the US. It is the 8th leading risk factor of death worldwide. It also perpetuates a lot of violence when involved. So 40% of all suicide attempts have alcohol involved, 54% of all violent crimes, and 80% of domestic disputes have alcohol involved. So when it comes to sexual assaults, 50% have alcohol included in them, either by the victim or the perpetrator or both. 1 American dies every 20 minutes because of alcohol. The leading cause of death between 16 to 24-year-olds, and it's the 60% of all ER admissions are alcohol related. So that has a huge amount of social consequences on us. Another depressant are the barbiturates and benzodiazepines. So these are, again, sedative hypnotic drugs. Benzodiazepines are used for anxiety and insomnia. These are things like your Klonopin, Xanax, Valium. Then barbiturates are used more for hypnosis or commonly as a seizure medication. They can also be used for anesthesia during surgery. They decrease coordination and cause amnesia. With barbiturates and benzodiazepines, they cause tolerance to develop very quickly, which, remember, tolerance is how much more you need in order to get the same effect. So long-term use can result in a lot of withdrawal symptoms because you may not be able to get more to develop that tolerance or to meet that tolerance. Compulsive use is lower in those of narcotics or stimulants, but multi-drug abuse occurs, typically with alcohol and narcotics. So basically, they're not abused very often where they're trying to take them compulsively, but they are typically abused by using them with other drugs, specifically alcohol. Another depressant is the opioids and opiates, which we hear a lot about this in this day and age with the opiate epidemic. So the different types of opioids are heroin, morphine, codeine, fentanyl, methadone. They're also commonly referred to as narcotics. Opioids derive from the opium poppy plant or some kind of synthetic compound. The common symptoms include a state of dreamy sleep, euphoria, anesthesia. It stimulates the reward center in our brain, but it slows down the central nervous system. It has a rapid building of tolerance and produces physical dependency very quickly, which is, again, why this is an epidemic. Typically, overdose is a decrease in breathing to the point of death. Heroin is the most commonly abused type of opioid. It enters the brain faster than morphine, but the abuse potential is just the same. Oxycontin has become a very popular drug, often is a gateway to heroin because once they stop being able to get the oxy, they go to the next source. Abuse varies on administrative, so they can be intravenous or smoked, but they're all addictive. Methadone can only be administered orally and has a very slow onset, but it lasts for a very long time. This is typically the drug that is used to help people get off of their opiate addiction. So it's more of a harm reduction approach because it is less harmful to them, but it takes longer for them to wean themselves off of it. So the next category is stimulants. This includes things like caffeine, nicotine, cocaine, amphetamines, and even some ADHD medications. The symptoms are increase or alerts the central nervous system, euphoria, anxiety. It triggers that fight or flight response and increases our heart rate. The long-term effects include heart attacks, seizures, respiratory failure, hypothermia, and even death. Many stimulants have a very quick tolerance building effect. So stimulants, a common stimulant is nicotine. Tobacco remains the leading most preventable cause of death in the United States, causing nearly 4,400,000 deaths each year. It results in an annual cost of more than $75 billion in direct medical costs. One of the most addictive drugs and causes addiction in the majority of its users. So that's really something to pay attention to. It's one of the most addictive. Withdrawal symptoms include anxiety, irritability, insomnia, and increased appetite. While nicotine does not directly cause cancer, other chemicals within the products are the ones that increase the risk for cancer and emphysema. Cocaine, it comes from the coca leaf. It is usually administered in many ways, injected, snorted, smoked. All of the smoking or the injection administration causes the drugs to enter the brain faster. Mixing cocaine and alcohol, again, is one of the most lethal multi-drug combinations, so that's important to know. And death from cocaine usually involves heart problems or seizures. Now, the difference between crack is it's the more addictive than cocaine. It speeds up the effects from minutes to seconds. The effects in the brain almost immediately, but is over in about 30 minutes. Typically lower in purity than cocaine is made to be smoked. Then the next stimulant we'll talk about is amphetamines and methamphetamines. These are things like crystal meth, ice, crank, ADHD medication. The ones that are addictive are Adderall, Ritalin, or Vyvanse. We also can include ecstasy in here, as it can be methamphetamine derivative and not regulated. Amphetamines are a man-made drug. They were first designed to treat asthma, and they were used in World War II to increase the awareness of soldiers that were very tired during the war. It later was used to treat narcolepsy, and then it moved on to ADHD medications. Here's some of those effects: increased energy, euphoria, talkativeness, heart rate. It decreases appetite, jaw clenching, nausea, vomiting. The long-term effects is it can create aggression, memory loss, even psychotic symptoms similar to schizophrenia, insomnia, or weight loss. Then with large quantities consumed, it can create tremors, loss of coordination, stroke, heart failure, or seizures. Prescription stimulants, like the ones found in the ADHD medication, enter the brain slowly but can last for long hours. They can even last up to 8 hours if they're built in with the extended release. Lower percentages of compulsive use, however, it still releases dopamine, thus still a risk for abuse or dependence. The last category is hallucinogens. This includes LSD, mushrooms. We're going to lump cannabis in here, but I'll talk more about that in a minute of how it fits into multiple categories. It also includes MDMA, ketamine, or PCP. A lot of the symptoms include hallucinations. It alters the mood, may cause anxiety, may increase paranoia. Some of these include peyote and PCP. The effects are similar to other hallucinogens. They cause excessive sweating. The main ingredient in peyote is mescaline, and they may also experience flashbacks. PCP, the users experience strength and power and invulnerability. They have a numbing effect on the mind. They mimic a lot of schizophrenic behavior and can increase the anxiety symptoms. It was originally developed in the 1950s as a surgical anesthetic. With Molly or MDMA, this increases arousal and was originally created to help couples in their couple therapy. Over time, it can actually reduce interest in or pleasure from sex, and it causes a significant reduction in mental abilities. This graph shows kind of what MDA and how MDMA affects a mammal such as monkeys. So in the first box, you see a lot of pink squiggly lines. This is serotonin. So these are in the monkeys that didn't have any MDMA. This is what their brains looked like. In the monkeys that had just taken ecstasy 2 weeks prior, you see there's like hardly any of their serotonin in their brain. And then even 7 years after their ecstasy use, there was still not very much, or there was more growth, but not as much. So that it is resilient, but it may take a long time each time that you're using marijuana, or I'm sorry, each time that you're using MDMA. So with MDMA, 12% of people between the ages of 18 and 25 have used it at one point. It can last anywhere between 4 to 6 hours and can be lethal at 3 to 4 times above one single dose. High levels of serotonin, so that's what causes that good feeling, and then it lessens the release of dopamine, but the drug can still be addictive. The biggest difference between ecstasy and Molly is their form. Molly sometimes is considered the purer form, as it contains less fillers. So ecstasy will contain fillers like meth, cocaine, ketamine, caffeine, sugar. Both are easily tampered with, especially in powder or capsule form, so something to be concerned about. Ecstasy is typically pressed and stamped into shapes. MDMA is an illegal substance, and there's no quality control over what goes into the manufacturing of this drug. So now that we've gone to cannabis, so cannabis kind of falls into all three categories. It can reduce anxiety, so it can be a depressant. It can increase appetite, which is why it's a stimulant. It can also fall into the hallucinogen category because it causes some hallucinations and disassociation for some people. It is the most used illegal drug in the United States. 52% of young adults have used it between ages 18 and 25, and 22.9 seniors in high school in the last month have used it, and 6% daily. It is one of those most controversial drugs in the US. There has been a huge uproar for decriminalization of medical use, even the legalization of marijuana for recreational purposes. It's most commonly used by smoking it, but it can also be ingested. It is the least toxic drug of all the drugs we've talked about today. The overdose includes panic attacks and dissociative experiences, but it's essentially impossible to actually die from this drug alone. It lasts longer than any other drug in the body, and people who use it every day can be chronically intoxicated. Again, the other drugs that kind of fall into hallucinogens but might also just be considered the synthetic drugs are club drugs like GHB, rohypnol, ketamine, inhalants, e-cigarettes, caffeine powder, steroids, bath salts, K2 and spice. All of these might fall into those synthetic ones. So I hope that has given you a little insight into how drugs impact the body, our society, and we'll learn more as we go throughout this semester.